kicking off a new series today. Woo! I'll try that again. We're kicking off a new series today. If you're part of this church or you've been following regularly, you'll know that we've been working our way through the Gospel of John. And we've been at it for a few months now, and we're up to chapter 7. But just so you don't get John fatigue, it's a real thing, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back to it at the start of next year. And so over the next 5 weeks in the lead up to church camp, we're going to journey through a new series. And I want to unpack the theme of this series, which is God is not a side dish. God is not a side dish. You know, I've done a lot of searching and a lot of thinking recently. I've done a lot of praying and a lot of seeking God about where we are at as a church and where the church at large is at in this day. I've particularly been asking and praying to God that He might reveal to me what is it that is the greatest challenge that we as followers of Jesus face in this cultural moment. Every cultural moment, every society at different stages in human history comes up against a few things that are pertinent to them battling with and engaging in the discipleship process. And I really wanted to hunker down, what is it that faces us here in Bright in the West? And I think as I've been thinking and praying that this is it. That God has become a side dish. That the affluence and the wealth of the West, the globalization of our world, the fact that we've had huge progressions in technology, like the internet and things like AI and smartphones, the fact that there's just a crazy efficiency now in global travel, the things like ubiquitous content that's always in front of us, that we're always consuming media, I think have culminated in a smorgasbord of amazing things to do and be a part of, right, in this modern world. Like the options are pretty much endless, right? I mean, these days, you can join a book club here in Bright, and you can chat about Dickens or Tolstoy or whatever with people in Poland, Pakistan, and Paraguay all at the same time. I mean, these days you can go to Melbourne, you can go to a restaurant, you can order, Japanese Wagyu, and that Wagyu could have been sourced and prepared that morning in Japan. These days you could, with the touch of one button, and don't do this now, you could pull out your phone, you could participate in a 12-week graduate course from Yale University or Harvard University on the psychology of human identity, right? For free. You didn't know that. It's true. Get an Apple Podcasts. These days you can play video games online with people in different time zones. You can have a jam session with your mates in the middle of nowhere, right? In the comfort of 24 degrees while it's snowing outside. All powered by electricity that comes from the sun. Like the limitless options that we experience these days is next level, right? Like if you were to tell your grandma even 30 years ago what you would have at your disposal today, it would literally blow her mind. David Brooks, in his book, The Second Mountain, writes this: modern society has unleashed a barrage of choice on all of us. At every instant, we are presented with a dazzling array of options, and we have the power to pivot at any instant to choose any one of those options. The modern world is a vast display table of options. I love that imagery. Have you ever seen a display table in like a jeweler? You go into a jeweler and they have these huge display tables of rings and, earrings and necklaces. This is what life is like for us, right? we have this huge display table of all these epic choices and things in front of us that we can partake of. All these options. And so what an amazing time to be alive, right? Right? Come on, what an amazing time to be alive. The blessings, the creativity, the choice, the freedom, literally limitless. However, the downside to all of this is that in light of these limitless and amazing options that we have to pursue and that we have to fill our time with, God has become a side dish. If I were a spiritual doctor and asked to diagnose to the best of my ability the greatest issue facing the average Christian today, the reason behind the continual erosion of spiritual maturity in Christians these days, the reason why the average Christian continues to see the basic disciplines of a spiritual life, things like reading the word, things like coming to church, things like praying corporately, continue to decline. The reason why the average Christian more or less doesn't see the supernatural manifest in their life these days. The reason between the gulf of the joy and the freedom and the power and the abundant life that is on offer in Christ and the experience of the joy and power and abundant life that Christians experience in Christ, this would be my diagnosis. That God has become a side dish. That in amongst an assortment of incredible things to do and give ourselves to, things like holidays, things like epic food, things like, top shelf content on platforms like YouTube or Disney or Netflix or Amazon. Things like sipping on perfect wine at Ringareef in the spring sun, or savoring a double ristretto at Sixpence on a Monday morning when it's quiet. That God for most of us, God for me, while He's still there, He's still present, He's still a wonderful and a valid option, has become exactly that. Just another option amongst a whole host of good options. And over the next 5 weeks, I want to unpack this. I want to highlight some of the contributing factors, some of the challenges facing us in the 21st century, some of the things that will sabotage even our most earnest efforts to follow Jesus if they're left undetected. And so this morning I want to begin by first drawing our attention to how our culture is setting us up in the first place to treat God as a side dish. And then I want to name this phenomena. So let's start with how. Because while there's a multitude of ways and things and contexts that we live in, given the fact that it's secular in nature, that work against our relationship with Jesus, that try and push God into the category of a social side dish, there's one thing I think that plays a disproportionate role in this progression. I think there's one thing that really shapes the worldview and the psyche of well-meaning Christians to just place God in this category of a side dish, to just treat Him as another valuable option among many. And it's probably not something you'd immediately think of. And it has to do with the evolution of economics. All right, everyone say the evolution of economic value through human history. Well, you didn't have to say that bit, but that was free. You see, once upon a time, I love hecklers. Once upon a time, humans lived in what was called an agrarian society, where the foundation of all that we did was based around the land, right? And the basis of the economy in an agrarian society centered around what we call commodities. Now, if you've never heard that word before, let me help you this morning. Commodities are really just three types of things. They're anything that you can grow in the ground, anything that you can raise on the ground, like lamb, or anything that you can extract from the ground, like gold or lead or things like that, right? And these are commodities. And these were the basic foundation of economic value for most of human history. However, after thousands of years, something profound happened in the 18th century that shifted and evolved the measuring stick of economic value. All you history buffs, what was it? The Industrial Revolution. No one under 40 knew that. You know, suddenly, sorry, that was suddenly people were moving off farms and into factories. All of a sudden, the emphasis shifted from commodities, the raw building blocks, into goods, into tangible things that you could make with these commodities, right? And so for a few hundred years, the economy was no longer one that was built on commodities. It was one that was built on goods. However, if you consult the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you will note that in the US, and it's pretty much mirrored perfectly for the rest of the developed world, that more or less 80% of the population no longer works in either the production of commodities or the manufacture of goods. All right, so if the economy was based on first commodities and then goods, and yet 80% of our population don't work in either, then what's happened? Well, I'll tell you. Like most of you who are teachers, or counselors, or managers, or cleaners, or builders, or nurses, landscapers, chefs, plumbers, marketers, biologists, IT specialists, business coaches, pastors, just to name a few. We are all part of what's known as the service revolution. You see, the core driver of economic value shifted again at the end of the 20th century. Economic value no longer centered around commodities and no longer centered around goods, but services. But, everyone say but. But, the story doesn't end there either. You see, toward the very end of the 20th century, particularly the start of the 21st century, so we're talking like 2000s, about 20 years ago, economic value transitioned once more and is in the midst right now of revolutionizing our world again. And this time, it went into what Joseph Pine and James Gilmore coined in their seminal work, the experience economy. The experience economy refers to an economic shift, listen to this, where value is found in creation and the commercialization of memorable and immersive experiences rather than focusing purely on goods or services. In the experience economy, Pine and Gilmore write, work is theater and business the stage. Goods and services are no longer enough. What consumers want today are experiences, memorable events that engage them and in an inherently personal way. And so you and I live in this economy. You and I live in an economy that doesn't center now around commodities. It doesn't center around goods. It doesn't even center around services, but ultimately centers around experiences. Creating memorable, engaging, personal experiences. And you don't have to look very hard or long to realize that this change in value proposition is already in full swing, right? I remember when I bought my first phone about 25 years ago. Are you ready for it? It was the mighty Nokia 3310. Come on, baby. Man, this thing loaded with features, right? It had a monochrome display. Now that's fancy speak for black and white. It had a calculator. It was one of few models to have a stopwatch. And you know what? Rob's all over it. You know what the best feature was? Snake 2. Man, the amount of time I gave myself to this game, I reckon I could have been fluent in French, learned how to ride a horse, and flipping been a Frisbee champion. Man, but I was good at Snake 2. And I remember walking into the store that particular day with my buddy Derek to buy my first phone. Now, you have to understand, my parents wouldn't let me buy a phone, right? And so I gave my money to Derek to let him buy the phone. So eventually when mum and dad found out that I had a phone, I could somewhat truthfully say, Derek gave it to me. Creative, right? You see, the thing I remember most, though, was walking into this shop and going to the phone cabinet. Do you remember the phone cabinet? It was glass, it was locked, and it was pretty much just this one shelf crammed with a million different variations and models of phones. Like, there was no hype, there was no fanfare. The person just grabbed the one you pointed to, scanned that sucker, you paid for it, done, right? Straightforward transaction. What's it like these days? You been into an Apple store or a Samsung store lately? Man, walking into one of those places like walking into an interactive museum. You can put goggles on, you're swiping things, there are sounds going all sorts of places. You see, experience is everything. Everything is shifted from a simple transaction into an immersive experience. What about coffee? One of my favorite things. 25 years ago, you bought a coffee just to get caffeinated, right? And cafes were usually pretty small, they were usually pretty dull, and no one really sat down unless they wanted to eat. 25 years later, whew, you go to some of these cafes, man, the building itself is like some architectural design masterpiece, right? We're talking mahogany furniture. We're talking like bespoke bars. We're talking, beautiful countertops. And these days, you don't just go to a cafe to eat or to have a coffee. You go to cafes for all sorts of things, right? You go to a cafe for a date. You go to a cafe to get some work done. You go to a cafe to people watch and just enjoy the ambience. And these days, not only do you get a drink, you don't even get a drink these days. Do you know what you get? If it's a good cafe, artwork. Look at some of these pictures from a young dude 3 weeks ago when I was in New York and what he busted out with a coffee machine. You ready? Look at this. Butterflies. See, it's a Pegasus, for goodness sake. A Pegasus. And this is what I want you to hear, right? Think about this. Right, can I change this? You're going to get distracted. Awesome artwork. Back to me. Look at me. Look at me. I want you to think about this, right? You ready? The commodity hasn't changed. The good, the drink itself, hasn't changed. The service, the fact that someone makes it for you in a relatively short time, hasn't changed. What's changed? The experience. The experience has changed. Now you don't just get a commodity. Now you don't just get a good. Now you don't even just get a service. You get a flippin' experience. You know, these days, once upon a time, it was enough to just go to Paris and get a picture in front of the Eiffel Tower, right? Boring! Not now. Man, you got to go and find some random vidyard somewhere that no one knows about that Beyonce threw an after party at once, and you need to get a selfie with that thing and plaster it all over Instagram. Or you got to find some nonna who makes handmade mustard, or makes handmade croissants from a recipe 6 generations down, right? That only some little niche group on Reddit or Instagram even knows about. Experience is everything. Memorable, engaging, personal experiences. And this has become the backdrop of our entire economy. This has become the basic unit of economic value these days. Personalized, memorable, engaging experiences. Now listen to this. What I want you to catch this morning is I want you to realize the impact that it's having on how we fundamentally think and engage with life. You see, if life is all about my experience, then God and the Christian journey are only useful, are only worthy of prioritizing to the degree that they enhance my experience. I'll say that again. If life is all about my experience, then God and the Christian journey is only as useful or worthy of prioritizing to the degree that they enhance my personal experience of life. And the great issue of this is that in a world that's all about my experience, it's ultimately a world all about me. Moi. Is that French? Moi? Moi. This is ultimately the reason that God's become a side dish, right? It's because we have become God. And the Bible has a name for this phenomena. You know what the name is? Idolatry. Idolatry. Remember the first commandment that God gave Israel in Exodus 20? He says, "You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods." And what we have to appreciate is that every aspect of our culture, every structure, every edifice, even the economy itself, is literally gearing us toward, is literally encouraging us, is enticing us at every moment of every day to make for ourselves an idol, to bow down and worship the God of self. But we have to see this for what it is: idolatry. You see, one of the great misconceptions about idolatry is that idolatry is just worshiping someone or something at the expense of God, right? It's more than that. You know, biblical idolatry is actually not just about worshiping someone or something instead of God. It's worshiping someone or something in conjunction with God. You know, most of the time that God deals with idolatry with Israel, it's not because they have, catch this, substituted God. It's because they've supplemented God. It's not because they've substituted, but they've supplemented. I mean, think about the basic premise, right? Not for too long and not in detail, but of having an affair, of being unfaithful. I want you to think about this. A person isn't considered as having an affair if they substitute one relationship for another, are they? No, they're considered to have an affair when they supplement a new relationship with their existing one. And this is what idolatry is: worshiping anything, including the God of self, the God of experience, in conjunction with God. Look at verse 9. The Lord was angry with Solomon, for his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. He had warned Solomon specifically about worshiping other gods, but Solomon did not listen to the Lord's command. And what I want you to notice here is that Solomon wasn't worshiping other gods instead of Yahweh. He was worshiping other gods in conjunction with Yahweh. Look at verse 4. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was what? Not fully devoted to the Lord, as the heart of his David, his father, had been. He followed Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord. What? Completely. As David, his father, had done. You see, Solomon still loved God, right? Solomon still worshipped God, but just as a package deal. A bit of God and a bit of everything else, just in conjunction with a bunch of other things. And ultimately, Solomon's issue was that he relegated God to a side dish. He made him just another good option amongst a whole host of good options. And the question for us this morning is so simple. Like Solomon, has God for us become a side dish? Has he become just another good option amongst a whole host of good options? You see, so many followers of Jesus struggle with the Christian journey. Struggle with, hearing God's voice, experiencing his presence, living with power, walking in freedom and love and security and in Jesus' identity. And it's simply as Jesus explained, because you can't serve two masters. And all I want to leave you with this morning is this. Before we can follow God with any effectiveness, with any degree of perpetuity, we have to start here. We have to come face to face with the God of this world. We have to come and confront the God of self. And we have to then declare in faith, with a crazy amount of regularity, every time that God pines to us to worship it, that God is not a side dish. Let's pray.